The chamber hummed with disdain, the vast hall of the Galactic Council filled with the murmurs of 1,000 species, each convinced of their own superiority. At the center of it all stood Ambassador Kael, the lone representative of Earth, his voice steady but ignored as he spoke of human ingenuity, of a people who had clawed their way from the mud of their planet to the stars themselves. The council members exchanged amused glances, their laughter ringing like the chime of arrogance. Humanity, a backwater species, they sneered, barely worth the oxygen they breathe. The vote was swift, unanimous. Earth would remain barred from the cosmic table, its potential dismissed as fantasy. But as the gavel struck, sealing their verdict, the alarms began to scream. Somewhere beyond the council's gleaming spires, beyond the reach of their smug certainty, humanity had done the impossible. Faster than light travel, a feat the greatest civilizations had taken millennia to master, had been cracked by a species they'd written off as insignificant. The alarms weren't just warnings, they were the sound of the galaxy's balance shattering. In that moment, the council's laughter died in their throats, replaced by something far more primal, the cold, creeping dread of being wrong. Because if humanity could defy the laws of physics so boldly, what else were they capable of? This isn't just a story about underdogs proving the doubters wrong. It's about the arrogance of power, the danger of underestimating those you deem beneath you. The Galactic Council had centuries of tradition, fleets that darkened the skies, technology that bordered on magic, and yet they forgot the one universal truth: ambition cannot be quantified. Humanity had looked at the stars and refused to accept no as an answer, and now the cosmos would learn what happens when you push a species with nothing left to lose. So lean in, because what comes next isn't just a victory, it's a reckoning, and you're about to witness every glorious, chaotic moment of it. The Odyssey wasn't supposed to be there. A navigation glitch, a misfired warp calculation, call it fate or sheer bad luck, but the human vessel slipped through the cosmic cracks, breaching a sector so heavily restricted, even the Galactic Council's own scouts needed clearance to enter. The second the Odyssey's sensors flickered back online, the crew knew something was wrong. The space around them hummed with energy, the stars veiled behind shimmering barriers, the kind of tech that screamed "stay out." Before they could even plot a retreat, the void erupted with Council enforcer ships gleaming, predatory, their weapons primed before the first transmission crackled through. Unauthorized vessel, power down immediately, surrender or be obliterated. The voice was cold, devoid of any curiosity, just another trespasser to be crushed beneath bureaucratic heels. But Captain Vance of the Odyssey had spent 30 years navigating the knife's edge of deep space, and he knew one thing above all else: humans didn't kneel. Not to storms, not to empires, and certainly not to self-appointed gatekeepers of the galaxy. His reply was as calm as it was defiant: negative, we don't take orders from strangers in our own sky. What happened next rewrote the rules of engagement in real time. The enforcers opened fire, expecting a quick, brutal end, a lesson for any species foolish enough to defy them. But the Odyssey wasn't just any ship. Human engineers had built her lean, fast, and unpredictable. Instead of returning fire head-on, Vance ordered an insane maneuver, a full reverse burn straight into the enforcers' formation. Their targeting systems, calibrated for orderly combat, couldn't lock onto a ship moving backward at combat speed. Then came the real stroke of madness. The Odyssey's crew vented their auxiliary fuel tanks, flooding local space with volatile plasma. A single spark from their aft thrusters turned the entire battlefield into a firestorm. The enforcers reeled, their pristine ships scorched and systems scrambled. They'd waged war by doctrine for centuries, but humans Humans fought like the universe owed them a win. By the time the Odyssey slipped into the safety of a blind jump, the Council's finest were left floating in disarray, staring at their broken sensors and one undeniable truth. Tactics born in Earth's war-torn history had just outmaneuvered the galaxy's so-called masters of war. And if one ship could do that, what chaos would an entire fleet unleash? High Chancellor Vex's laughter echoed through the council chambers, sharp and dismissive, as the reports of the Odyssey's escape played on the holographic display. "A fluke," he declared, waving a hand as if swatting away an insect. "One ship slips through our fingers, and suddenly we tremble. Humanity is a temporary nuisance, nothing more." The other council members murmured agreement, their confidence unshaken, but Seeris, Vex's most trusted advisor, stood silent, her 3 eyes fixed on the data scrolling before her. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of centuries of strategic foresight. "You misunderstand what we're facing. Humans don't just stumble into victory, they consume it. Every setback, every scrap of knowledge becomes fuel. They adapt faster than any species we've recorded. Underestimate them, and we won't just lose a skirmish. We'll lose the war," Vex scoffed, his pride a wall no logic could breach. "Then we crush them before they become a problem, seal their system, let them choke on their own ambition." The order went out, a full blockade of Earth, a ring of warships so thick not even light could slip through unnoticed. The Council's engineers assured him it was flawless, an impenetrable barrier that would leave humanity stranded, helpless, and finally obedient. What Vex didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was that the Odyssey's crew hadn't just escaped that day. They'd brought home a trophy. Deep in the underground shipyards of Mars, teams of human scientists huddled over the wreckage of a salvaged Enforcer drone, its shattered hull humming with secrets. Council technology, once untouchable, now lay bare under human hands. Their engineers worked in shifts, sleepless, driven by something the Galactic Council had long forgotten: the raw, relentless hunger of the overlooked. Reverse engineering wasn't just a science to humanity, it was an art, and within weeks they'd cracked the Enforcer's shielding, their weapons, even the crude beginnings of their warp drives. While Vex's blockade tightened its grip, humanity was already building, not just ships, but something far more dangerous, a blueprint. Every piece of stolen tech, every scar from the Council's arrogance, was folded into their designs. The galaxy had tried to cage them, but humans had a habit of turning cages into springboards, and when the first human-made warp core flared to life in a hidden asteroid base, the message was clear. The Council had hoped to strangle Earth in its crib. Instead, they'd handed humanity the keys to the universe and taught them exactly where to aim. The Council blockade fleet arrived in high orbit expecting docility, a starving Earth, its people groveling for scraps of mercy. Instead, they found teeth. Admiral Zhao's face flickered across every viewscreen in the Armada, his grin sharp enough to cut Durasteel. "You thought we'd beg." His voice was a blade wrapped in silk. "Funny, we've been busy." The transmission cut just as the first plasma round tore through the lead battleship's shields. What unfolded wasn't a battle, it was a revelation. Earth's orbit bristled with defenses cobbled together from stolen tech, reverse-engineered scrap, and pure human stubbornness. Plasma cannons, ripped from the wreckage of Enforcer drones, now sat bolted to repurposed asteroid miners, their targeting systems calibrated by engineers who'd learned war in back-alley server hubs. Stealth mines, jury-rigged from dead Council probes, floated like ghosts in the void, detonating only when the enemy was too close to evade. The blockade fleet had come to enforce a quarantine. Instead, they walked into a slaughterhouse built by amateurs who refused to die politely, High Command had assumed humans would fight like every other species, by the rules. But Zhao's strategy was pure Earth, asymmetrical, brutal, and utterly unpredictable. When the Council ships rolled forward in their textbook formation, they found their flanks gutted by hit-and-run strikes from refueled colony ships, their hulls studded with railguns. When they tried to regroup, their comms drowned under a deluge of hacked signals, every frequency screaming the same taunt in 100 human languages, "Welcome to the neighborhood." And then came the masterstroke. As the Council's dreadnoughts reeled, their sensors lit up with a new horror. The debris field from their own shattered vessels wasn't just debris. Human salvage teams, suited in patched-together exo-skins, were already swarming the wrecks, hauling intact shield generators and engine cores back to Earth's dry docks. Even in the middle of a firefight, humanity was scavenging, learning, evolving. By the time the Council fleet limped out of range, their pristine armor scorched and their pride in tatters, one truth echoed through every surviving ship: this wasn't suppression. It was the first stroke of a war they'd arrogantly assumed couldn't exist, and down on the blue marble below, amid the smoke of 100 welding torches and the roar of a species that had just tasted defiance, the message was clear. The galaxy had tried to lock humanity in a cage. Earth had just handed them the bill for the hinges. Commander Hale's strike team didn't wait for an invitation. They didn't need one. While the Council's admirals obsessed over battle lines and honor codes, human raiders slipped through the cracks of the galaxy like shadows with teeth. Stolen warp drives, pried from the wreckage of defeated enforcers, carried them behind enemy lines, not to face fleets head-on, but to vanish into the dark between stars, striking where the Council felt safest. Supply depots, repair stations, even communication relays, Hale's teams hit them all with surgical precision, leaving fire and confusion in their wake. The Council's response was textbook: deploy patrols, tighten security, assume order would eventually prevail. But Hale's voice, crackling over captured comm channels as another depot erupted into flame, carried a lesson they still hadn't learned: you fight by rules. We fight to win. It wasn't just a boast, it was doctrine. Human history was written in the ashes of empires that underestimated irregulars, from ancient guerrillas in jungles to rebels in asteroid belts. Now, that same brutal pragmatism had gone interstellar. Take the raid on Depot Theta 7. The Council had fortified it with overlapping shield grids and a full battalion of automated sentries. Impressive. If you expected enemies to march up the front gate, Hale's team came in through the waste vents, riding the current of discarded coolant like predators slipping through a river's current. They didn't just sabotage the reactor core, they reprogrammed the depot's own defense drones to turn on reinforcements rushing to help. By the time the smoke cleared, the survivors were left staring at a single graffitied message on the blast doors, scrawled in plasma torch marks: "Thanks for the gear." And that was the real genius of it. Every strike wasn't just destruction, it was a down payment. Stolen weapons were stripped for parts, shield schematics uplinked to Earth's engineers, even ration packs repurposed for black market deals that funneled intel back to human cells. The Council kept treating these raids as inconveniences, temporary chaos to be managed. They didn't grasp the larger pattern. Humanity wasn't just fighting a war. They were conducting the galaxy's most aggressive internship, reverse engineering an empire piece by bloody piece. Meanwhile, High Command's reports grew increasingly frantic. Convoys vanished without distress calls. Outposts went dark mid-transmission. The few survivors babbled about hit-and-run attacks by ships that shouldn't exist, vessels patched together from a dozen species tech, their hulls a Frankenstein tapestry of stolen progress. The Council's greatest nightmare wasn't losing territory. It was realizing, too late, that they'd handed humanity the tools to outgrow them, because here's the thing about rules: they only matter if both sides agree to play by them. And in the cold, unforgiving dark between stars, humanity had just torn up the rulebook and lit it on fire. The encrypted transmission from Seeris arrived in fragments, bouncing through dead drop relays across 3 neutral systems before finally coalescing in Kael's private terminal. The holographic projection flickered to life, her 3 eyes narrowed with urgency. "They're blind," she hissed, her voice barely louder than the static between stars. "The Council still sees your people as feral things too chaotic to predict, too primitive to matter. That's their weakness." Kael leaned forward, the glow of the projection etching shadows across his face. For the first time since Earth's exile, his lips curled into something too sharp to be called a smile. "Then let's remind them what happens when animals get cornered." What followed wasn't a strategy, it was a revelation. Seeris's data spilled across screens in Earth's war rooms, troop deployments, supply routes, even the psychic dampeners shielding the Council's inner sanctums. Every vulnerability laid bare, not just as targets, but as patterns. The Council's strength was its rigidity, its unshakable faith in hierarchy. Every decision flowed from the top down, every response calibrated by centuries of doctrine. Humanity's advantage, chaos with a purpose. Kael's fingers danced over the holographic star chart, tracing lines only he could see. "They expect us to hit their fleets, their fortresses. So we don't." The plan unfurled like a poison blooming in water strikes against infrastructure, so mundane the Council had forgotten to defend it. Docking clamps on their luxury stations, programmed to fail mid-approach. Maintenance drones in their shipyards, quietly rerouted to chew through power conduits. Even the atmospheric processors on their garden worlds, subtly adjusted to leach oxygen just enough to induce headaches in their ruling caste. "They call us animals," Kael murmured to the generals gathered around him. "Good, animals don't duel, they don't declare war, they just eat." Meanwhile, Seeris's final warning echoed through the silence: "They'll retaliate. Not with fleets, but with lies. They'll paint you as monsters to the neutral systems." Kael's response was a laugh, low and knowing. "Let them, monsters, win wars." He tapped the star chart, and the hologram dissolved into 1,000 glowing points, not just targets, but a map of the galaxy's fear. The Council had spent millennia building an empire on the myth of its own invincibility. Now, humanity would tear it down one whispered secret at a time. The holographic display flickered to life in Vex's private chamber, the blue glow casting jagged shadows across his scaled features. At first, the scene seemed impossible. Vega Prime's defense fleet, 12 pristine warships of the second battle group, arrayed in perfect formation against what should have been a ragged human flotilla. But then the feed zoomed in, and the truth became undeniable. Those weren't human ships anymore, not entirely. Cruisers that had once been jury-rigged from mining vessels now pulsed with stolen Council shield tech, their jagged silhouettes adorned with sleek, alien plating. Fighter wings darted between them, their propulsion systems burning an eerie hybrid of human plasma and something far more advanced. And at the center of it all, the Odyssey, its hull now a patchwork mosaic of scavenged Enforcer armor and Earth-born steel, unleashed a salvo that defied every tactical database in the galaxy. Vex's claws dug into his armrest as the first battle group ship detonated, its core breached by a beam weapon that shouldn't exist. Human engineers had done the unthinkable, fused their crude railgun tech with the Council's own particle accelerators, creating something brutally efficient. Ship after ship erupted like supernovas caught in a cage, their vaunted shielding useless against weapons that blended human pragmatism with stolen alien precision. Then the comms crackled, and Captain Vance's face filled the screen, his smirk a blade of pure defiance. "Regretting your vote yet?" The words weren't just mockery, they were a reckoning. Behind him, Vega Prime's orbital docks burned, their skeletal frames collapsing as human boarding parties systematically stripped them bare. Every explosion wasn't just destruction, it was a statement. The Council had tried to contain humanity with blockades and decrees, but the humans had turned their own technology into a crowbar, prying open the galaxy, one stolen secret at a time. Vex's hologram flickered as another warship died, screaming across the feed. Somewhere in the static, he could almost hear Seeris's warning echoing, "They adapt. They consume," and now, as the last battle group ship shattered into a million glittering fragments, the truth settled over him like a funeral shroud. This wasn't a battle. It wasn't even a war anymore, it was an education, and humanity had just become the galaxy's most ruthless teacher. The chamber of the Galactic Council had always echoed with the measured hum of absolute control until it didn't. High Chancellor Vex's latest address disintegrated into a cacophony of screeching translation modules as representatives from a dozen species erupted in accusation. The Diraxian ambassador slammed his chitinous fist against the podium, his voice a venomous hiss. "You assured us they were primitive, that their defiance would be crushed like insects." Across the hall, the Tarkalan delegation's frills flushed crimson with fury, their leader spitting, "Your arrogance lit this fire. Now our trade routes burn with human raiders." Vex's scales darkened under the chamber's harsh lights, his once unshakable authority fraying like a severed cable. The data streams flanking his podium told the real story. Fringe worlds, once obedient, now blazed with unrest. On screen after screen, footage played of mining colonies overthrowing their overseers, their rallies echoing with a borrowed battle cry like "Earth, we rise." The humans hadn't just broken the Council's military invincibility, they'd shattered the myth of its infallibility, and myths, once cracked, are impossible to repair. In the shadows of the chamber, Seeris watched the chaos unfold, her third eye pulsing with grim satisfaction. She'd warned them, they'd called her paranoid. Now, the Council's greatest strength, its unity, was unraveling at the seams. The Mendari blamed the Tarkalans for lax patrols. The Tarkalans accused the Diraxians of hoarding shield tech. And the Diraxians, they'd already begun recalling their fleets, a silent admission that loyalty to the Council was no longer the safest bet. But the true reckoning came not from the halls shouting matches, but from the whispers beyond it. On the industrial world of Xiphus, workers sabotaged fusion reactors rather than fuel another Council warship. In the methane slums of Kael's Hollow, dissidents broadcast human victory feeds on stolen holoprojectors. Even the mercenary guilds, long the Council's enforcers, began hedging their bets. Some were already smuggling human agents past blockades for a fee. Vex's final mistake was assuming rebellion required fleets and formal declarations. Humanity had taught the galaxy a far deadlier lesson. Empires rot from the inside first. As emergency sirens wailed through the Council's spire, another system declaring independence, another fleet ignoring recall orders, the High Chancellor stared at the holographic star chart. The once cohesive web of Council control now flickered with fractures, each one pulsing like a heartbeat, and somewhere, in the dark between stars, Kael's voice crackled over a stolen comm channel, just loud enough to be heard over the sound of a galaxy waking up. Funny, isn't it? They spent centuries building walls, never stopped to ask what happens when the bricks decide to walk away. The Starbreaker wasn't just a weapon, it was the Council's final confession of fear. A relic from an older, crueler age, the massive orbital platform had drifted in silent mothballs for centuries, a monument to the kind of violence even the Council had once deemed too monstrous to wield. But as their empire crumbled, desperation drowned their scruples. The activation codes slithered through secure channels, whispered between trembling lips, as if the universe itself might recoil at their revival. Kael intercepted the transmission in the dead of night, the data stream bleeding across his screen like a wound. For a heartbeat, he just stared, the weight of what he was seeing pressing the air from his lungs. Then he was moving, boots pounding through the corridors of Earth's last hidden shipyard, the raw schematics of the Starbreaker burning in his palm. He found engineer Patel elbow-deep in the guts of a scavenged Council cruiser, her hands black with reactor grease, her eyes already alight with the kind of manic focus that bent physics to its will. She took one look at the schematics and laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that cut through the fear like a plasma torch. Oh, this is perfect. What Patel saw in those schematics wasn't just doom, it was leverage. The Starbreaker wasn't some sleek, invincible terror. It was a patchwork beast, its systems jury-rigged across generations, its core held together by layers of obsolete code and half-forgotten protocols. "They're so proud of their monster," she muttered, fingers dancing over the holographic blueprints. They didn't even notice the cracks. Her team worked in shifts so brutal they blurred together, fueled by stimulants and sheer spite, tearing apart the Council's own stolen tech for answers. Then came the breakthrough. Deep in the Starbreaker's archaic targeting system lay a glitch, a blind spot where its safety protocols conflicted with its newer shield harmonics. Patel's voice was eerily calm when she explained it to the War Council. "It's a backdoor. Their weapon needs to believe it's defending something to fire at full power. We just have to make it think Earth is home." The countermeasure was as elegant as it was vicious. A swarm of hacked navigation beacons, each screaming counterfeit Council signatures, would trick the Starbreaker into seeing its own fleet around Earth. Then, at the critical moment, a single modified torpedo packed not with warheads, but with a virus older than human spaceflight, would slip into the platform's guts. The virus, salvaged from a derelict Council surveillance drone, was designed to do one thing: make machines forget who they served. When the Starbreaker's activation alarm finally blared across the system, the Council's admirals smiled. Right up until their screens flared with the platform's new targeting solution, locking not on Earth, but on the heart of their own fleet. Panic erupted as the weapon's colossal barrels swiveled, its systems now blind to human signatures, its sensors flooding with the ghostly echoes of Patel's beacons. The last thing the Council's command ship heard before the beam tore through them was Kael's voice, cool as the void itself. "You built a tomb, we just redirected the address." And as the Starbreaker's fury turned inward, vaporizing the very fleet that had activated it, the galaxy learned the true cost of underestimating humanity. Not just their resilience, not just their cunning, but their uncanny ability to turn your own weapons into mirrors and force you to stare at the monster you'd become. Alarms howled through the Odyssey's corridors like wounded animals, the sound of 1,000 systems screaming in unison as the ship tore through the Starbreaker's innards. The superweapons' defenses had been brutal auto-turrets that liquefied armor, gravity traps that crushed whole decks into diamonds, but none of it mattered now. Engineer Patel's fingers flew over her console, her voice steady despite the shuddering deck beneath her. "Virus is live, 30 seconds to cascade failure." Captain Vance didn't flinch. He just leaned into the comm, his grin audible even over the din. "Everyone hold onto something fun." The Odyssey's engines roared, not away from the Starbreaker, but deeper into its heart, riding the shockwave of its own sabotage like a surfer on a collapsing star. Behind them, the virus unspooled through the superweapon's veins, twisting its systems into paradoxes. Targeting arrays forgot their purpose. Shield generators mistook friend for foe. And deep in the core, the Starbreaker's ancient AI spasmed as Patel's code forced it to remember the one thing it was designed to erase: mercy. The final stroke was poetic. As the Odyssey punched through the Starbreaker's crumbling hull, Vance tapped a single button not for evasive maneuvers, but to broadcast an open channel. His voice, dripping with mock innocence, echoed across every council frequency in the sector. Oops, then the warp drive kicked in, yanking the ship into the black just as the Starbreaker's core went critical. What happened next wasn't an explosion, it was an unraveling. The superweapon didn't detonate outward, it collapsed inward, its own gravity fields turning against it like a snake eating its tail. One moment, the Starbreaker loomed over the battlefield, a monument to the Council's wrath. The next, it folded into a pinprick of light and vanished without so much as a shockwave. The Council fleet, still scrambling to regroup, suddenly found themselves staring at empty space where their ultimate weapon had been, and somewhere in the silence between stars, the Odyssey's crew erupted into laughter, their voices bouncing off the hull like victory bells. Because humanity hadn't just beaten the Starbreaker, they'd turned it into a punchline. Vex's flagship tore through the void like a blade, its golden prow gleaming with the last defiance of a dying empire. The High Chancellor's holographic address flickered across every loyalist vessel, his voice thick with the rasp of sleepless nights and shattered pride. Today we burn their cradle to ash, no more tricks, no more scavenged scraps, just the purity of annihilation. His words hung over the armada like a curse, thousands of warships pivoting toward the blue-green jewel of Sol with weapons primed. What they found wasn't fear, it wasn't even a fleet in the traditional sense. Humanity met them with swarms of fighters so nimble they seemed to laugh at physics, squadrons banking through kill zones at impossible angles, their hulls stripped to skeletal frames for maximum speed. Council gunnery officers choked on their own panic as targeting systems struggled to lock onto ships that moved less like machines and more like living things. "They're not flying," gasped one comms officer as a human pilot threaded through a hail of plasma fire without losing velocity. "They're dancing." The battle became a study in contrasts. The Council's formations were textbook perfect, their firepower overwhelming, their technology centuries ahead, and none of it mattered. Human squadrons flowed around their advances like water around stone, striking not at the warships themselves, but at the fragile connections between them. Relay buoys exploded in cascades of sparks, severing communication chains. Supply tenders vented atmosphere as sabotage teams materialized from sensor shadows. Even the Council's mighty dreadnoughts found themselves crippled not by direct assault, but by 1,000 precise cuts to their support systems, and then came the coup de grace. As Vex's flagship surged forward, its main battery charging for a killing blow against Earth's last orbital defense platform, every screen aboard lit up with the same transmission. Not from human high command, not from some admiral or politician, from a single fighter pilot, Kael Sign Wraith, whose camera showed her gloved hand hovering over a detonator. The background wasn't her cockpit, it was the interior of an abandoned Council supply depot, its walls lined with enough stolen antimatter ordnance to crack a planet. "Turn around," she said, her voice eerily calm, "or learn how humans say goodbye." Vex's roar of fury shook the bridge, his claws gouging the command throne. Every instinct screamed to call her bluff, to sacrifice the depot and take Earth with it, but as his tactical display flickered with fresh alerts, 6 more depots suddenly broadcasting identical feeds from unknown infiltrators. The truth curdled in his gut. This wasn't a feint. Humanity had turned their own logistics network into a galaxy-spanning dead man's switch. Somewhere in the chaos, a junior officer whispered the phrase that would echo through history: "They don't just defeat you. They make sure you helped." The Council fleet broke, not in a rout, not in disgrace, but in something far worse. A slow, shuddering retreat, each ship peeling away with the dawning realization that every system they'd ever taken for granted had become a weapon pointed back at them. And as the last loyalist vessel vanished from Sol's edge, Earth's defenders didn't cheer. They simply turned their battered ships toward home, already calculating how much of the abandoned Council tech could be salvaged before the next fight. Because one thing was certain: this wasn't an ending, it was an invitation. The bridge of Vex's flagship was a graveyard of flickering screens and sparking consoles, the air thick with the acrid stench of melted circuits and something far more primal: terror. The High Chancellor slumped in his command throne, his once pristine robes now singed and stained, his claws gripping the armrests like a drowning man clinging to wreckage. Outside the shattered viewports, the remains of the Council's armada drifted in lifeless hulks, their proud formations reduced to floating tombs. Then the doors hissed open, and Kael stepped through, his boots clicking against the deck with deliberate calm. He didn't gloat, didn't sneer. He simply stood there, silhouetted by the emergency lighting, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the ruin of the galaxy's most powerful being. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than Vex expected, almost conversational. "Funny, isn't it? All those centuries of calling us animals, and in the end, you're the ones who brought knives to a supernova." Vex's jaw tightened, his pride warring with the cold, creeping realization of defeat. "You'll execute us, then make a spectacle of it." Kael tilted his head, as if considering the idea, then reached into his coat. Vex flinched, but the human didn't draw a weapon. He pulled out a data slab, its surface pulsing with a holographic star chart. "We're not you," Kael said, tossing it onto the command console. The projection bloomed to life, displaying a galaxy segmented not by Council edicts, but by a web of interconnected systems, human colonies, yes, but also Diraction trade hubs, Tarkalan research stations, even Kel's Hollow's methane refineries. "All linked, all equal. Join us," Kael said, his voice firm but devoid of malice. "Not as subjects, not as defeated foes, as partners." The word hung in the air like a detonation waiting to happen. Vex's advisors stared at the projection, their faces cycling through disbelief, outrage, and slowly, irresistibly calculation. The offer wasn't just mercy. It was a mirror, forcing the Council to confront the truth they'd spent millennia avoiding. Their empire had been built on fear, but humanity's would be built on something far more dangerous. Choice. Vex's laughter was a broken thing, stripped of its old certainty. "And if we refuse," Kael didn't blink, "then you'll watch the future happen without you." He turned to leave, pausing only at the threshold to glance back, his eyes reflecting the dying light of the Council's dominion. "But here's the thing about walls, Chancellor. Once you've seen what's on the other side, no amount of pride can rebuild them." And with that, he walked out, leaving the most powerful beings in the galaxy to wrestle with the one weapon they'd never learned to counter: the unbearable weight of what might have been. The chamber was silent when Kael entered, not the forced quiet of obedience, but the hush that comes when history pivots. The Galactic Council's once gleaming dais was scorched now, its holographic banners flickering like dying stars. He didn't climb the steps, he strode through them, the remnants of 100 species parting before him like grass before wildfire. Seeris stood at his side, her third eye crinkled with something that wasn't quite amusement. Not yet, you called us pests, Kael said, his voice carving through the stillness. Dangerous but manageable, like a storm to be weathered. He paused, letting the words sink into the scorched metal and broken pride around them. But storms don't negotiate, they don't build. A flick of his wrist, and the central display erupted with schematics not of weapons, but of warp lanes humming with trade ships, research stations buzzing with mixed species teams, even the first prototypes of a shared defense grid, its blueprints already peppered with Tarkelian harmonics and Diraxian alloy formulas. The High Chancellor's surviving advisors shifted, their feathers or scales or chitin twitching with the dawning horror of understanding. This wasn't a surrender. It wasn't even a treaty. Humanity hadn't shattered their empire to rule its corpse, they'd done it to reforge the pieces. Seeris finally let her smile break free, sharp as a knife's edge. You spent millennia fearing rebellion, she murmured, but the real threat was always vision. When Kael took the central podium, the same spot where Vex had once declared Earth unworthy of breathing civilized air, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The council is dead. What rises from its ashes won't be yours. It won't even be ours. The screens behind him flared to life again, this time showing the Orion Accords, a sprawling, living document already signed by fringe worlds and mercenary guilds, its articles scrawled in a dozen languages, its amendments updated in real time by argument and consensus. No decrees, no ultimatums, just a single, unshakable clause at its heart. No species gets left behind again. The last holdout was the Diraxian admiral, her carapace still streaked with plasma burns from the final battle. She bared her mandibles, hissing, "And if we refuse," Kael didn't blink, "then enjoy your independence, but ask yourself this, when the next crisis comes, when the universe throws something at us that no one species can face alone, who do you want standing beside you? The ghosts of the past, or the people who turned scavenged trash into a superweapon's undoing?" No one cheered. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic pledges. Just the quiet tap of claws on datapads as the first signatures flickered across the accords, one by one by one, because in the end, humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their adaptability, their cunning, or even their defiance. It was their ability to make the impossible seem obvious. So when the chamber doors finally hissed open to the roar of construction crews, already dismantling the council's barricades outside, no one protested. Not even when Kael turned his back on them all and walked out, already barking orders about salvage rights and hydroponic subsidies. After all, revolutions are loud. But rebuilding, that's where the real work begins. The council's lower districts always smelled like ozone and desperation, too many species crammed into too little space, their anger simmering just beneath the surface of forced civility. That's where the whispers started, not in the gleaming spires where the surviving elite plotted their comebacks, but in the sulfur-stained alleys of the Diraxian labor camps, where workers passed coded taps through ventilation shafts. Not in official briefings, but in the Tarkelian mess halls, where off-duty soldiers let their helmets slip just enough to murmur, "They bleed same as we do." The shadowy figure moved through these spaces like smoke, their features obscured by a cloak woven from salvaged stealth mesh. At the broken-down cantina on level 47, where the drinks were watered down and the surveillance drones conveniently short-circuited, they leaned over a table littered with stolen weapon schematics and said the words that would ignite 1,000 fires. "They're not invincible. Just lucky." Skeptical snorts followed until gloved hands unfolded a holodisk showing the aftermath of Vega Prime, grainy but unmistakable, human wreckage floating amid the victory, twisted metal and frozen corpses proving that for all their ingenuity, they could still die. What spread next wasn't a rebellion, not yet. It was something far more dangerous, a pattern, Underground slicers dissected every battle, every raid, and found the cracks. Humans relied on chaos, yes, but chaos required momentum. Cut their supply lines, isolate their scavengers, force them to fight on your terms. The whispers grew teeth, spreading through dockworker strikes and sabotaged relay stations. A Diraction machinist, her carapace still smeared with grease from repairing human-captured drones, etched the new mantra into the hull of a decommissioned frigate: steal their luck. Meanwhile, in the ruins of the Council's old intelligence hub, Seeris watched the reports flood in with narrowed eyes. She'd expected defiance from the fringe worlds, but this was coordinated. Someone was stitching the discontent into a weapon, and the threads led back to that damned cantina, to a cloaked figure whose name no one could recall 5 minutes after meeting them. She tapped a claw against her terminal, pulling up the only image anyone had ever captured, a distorted silhouette, one hand resting on the hilt of a blade that looked suspiciously human in design. The message was clear: humanity hadn't just defeated the Council, they'd inspired something infinitely harder to control, the realization that gods could be toppled. And now, somewhere in the dark, the galaxy's forgotten were learning how to wield that truth. The war was over, the game had just changed. The dust of Mars clung to Engineer Patel's visor like a veil of secrets as she knelt in the shadow of the monolith. It shouldn't have been here, buried beneath the rusted plains, its edges too precise, its surface etched with symbols that made her translator spit static. Her team had stumbled upon it by accident while scavenging for salvage, but one brush of her glove against that alien metal sent her pulse skyrocketing. The markings weren't just unfamiliar, they were impossible. Back in the makeshift lab aboard the Odyssey, the scans confirmed it. Carbon dating placed the structure's age at 500,000 years, long before human cities, before written language, before fire. But the real horror came when Patel cross-referenced the symbols with stolen Council archives. The glyphs matched, not perfectly, not cleanly, but enough to trace a lineage. This was their creator's work. Whoever, whatever had engineered the Council's rise had also left this on Mars. A warning, a cradle, a time bomb. Patel's fingers trembled as she pulled up the decrypted files. The Council's oldest records spoke of a species too volatile to control, a genetic experiment scrapped before it could mature. Project Vanguard, the text called it. Discarded, terminated, except the records were wrong. The experiment hadn't been destroyed, it had been buried, left to gestate in isolation on a backwater world, its potential hidden beneath layers of evolutionary noise. Until now, the screen flickered with genetic models, side-by-side comparisons of human DNA and something eerily similar, not a match, a precursor. Patel's breath fogged her visor as she whispered, "We weren't just born fighters. We were designed for it." The implications slammed into her like a freight train. Humanity's ingenuity, their relentless adaptability, even their capacity for violence. It wasn't luck. It was programming, and the Council's creators had known, they'd feared it. Somewhere in the void, Kael's voice crackled over the comm, urging her to report. Patel didn't answer immediately. She stared at the holograms twisting above her console, at the truth unraveling like a double helix in the dark. This changed everything. Not just the war, not just the Council, but humanity's very place in the cosmos. They'd always wondered why they'd been barred from the stars. Now they knew. The galaxy hadn't been keeping them out, it had been locking them in. The chamber's lights flickered as Kael stepped forward, the weight of centuries pressing down on every word. "This wasn't an oversight," he said, his voice slicing through the Council's stunned silence. "It was design." The holograms around him twisted, displaying the Mars monolith, the genetic models, the archive fragments. each piece clicking into place like a bullet chambering. You didn't just dismiss us because we were primitive, you did it because your creators programmed you to. A Diraxian envoy recoiled, his chitin rattling. Blasphemy, but Seeris was already moving, her third eye dilating as she deciphered the data streams. No, she breathed. It's history. The screens flared to life with ancient schematics, blueprints of the Council's earliest species, their DNA laced with obedience protocols, their instincts honed to kneel before the unseen architects of the galaxy. Kael's lips curled. You were never the masters, you were the tools. The High Chancellor's hologram wavered, his scales dull with realization. Then why reveal this now? Kael's laugh was bitter, sharp, because we found something else in those ruins. The display shifted again, zooming in on a single glyph buried beneath the Martian soil, a symbol that matched no archive, no record. A countermand, your masters left a kill switch, not for us, for you. Gasps rippled through the chamber as the implications detonated. The Council's dominance, their hierarchy, even their hatred of humanity, none of it was choice. It was code, and the ones who'd written it, they'd left a backdoor. Kael leaned in, his shadow swallowing the dais. So ask yourselves, who's really pulling the strings? The silence that followed wasn't just shock. It was the sound of a galaxy waking up to its own chains. The Council's great halls, once sanctuaries of order, now thrummed with the discord of 1,000 fractured loyalties. On one side stood the purists' Diraxian warlords, Tarkalan traditionalists, their battle standards emblazoned with the old sigils of dominion. Across from them, the reformists formed their ragged lines, mercenary guilds who'd tasted human ingenuity, fringe world delegates sick of ancient hierarchies, even a contingent of Kael's hollow methane miners waving plasma torches like banners. What began as whispered dissent in shadowed corridors had erupted into open war, the very architecture of the Council's citadel trembling under artillery, salvos exchanged between former allies. Vance watched the carnage from the bridge of the Iron Resolve, his new flagship, a gutted Council dreadnought reforged with human tenacity and stolen tech. The holographic battle map pulsed before him, a spiderweb of crimson and gold marking loyalist strongholds and rebel redoubts. His fingers trailed through the projection, pausing over the Kalshir Plateau, where purist legions had dug in behind 3 layers of siege shields. There nesting, he muttered to his tactical officers, thinking we'll play by their rules. A slow grin split his grizzled features, time to reintroduce them to the concept of asymmetry. The assault began not with a frontal charge, but with silence. Vance's fleet slipped past sensor grids using a trick they'd learned from human raiders, overloading comm relays with bursts of static, then riding the interference like shadows. When the first wave hit, it wasn't warships that breached the plateau's defenses. It was the very earth beneath the purists' feet, mining charges, planted weeks earlier by defecting labor drones, turned the battlefield into a collapsing jigsaw. As the purists scrambled, Vance's voice crackled across every frequency, crisp and relentless. Break them fast, break them hard. What followed wasn't battle, it was butchery with a purpose. Human-piloted hunter-killer drones swarmed disabled walkers, not to destroy them, but to hack their systems and turn their guns on reinforcements. Saboteurs disguised as medics slipped through triage tents, injecting sedatives into water supplies. Even the weather-turned traitor, electrostatic scramblers summoned acidic rain that ate through purist armor seams. By nightfall, the plateau belonged to the reformists, its conquerors less an army than a phenomenon, an avalanche of chaos wearing human fingerprints. Yet for all their victories, Vance knew the real war wasn't fought with plasma or stealth. It unfolded in the whispers of conscripted soldiers who hesitated before firing on former comrades, In the way, Tarkhelan younglings scrawled human battle glyphs on their armor. The Council had built its empire on the lie of its own inevitability. Now, every rebel victory, every purist rout, chipped away at that illusion. As the iron resolve banked toward the next battlefield, its hull still streaked with Kalshir's ash, Vance allowed himself one moment to study the stars. Somewhere out there, Kael was weaving the political noose, Patel was cracking more of the architect's secrets, and the galaxy, it was learning the oldest human truth of all, that the most dangerous thing in the universe isn't a weapon. It's an example. The alarms shrieked through the rebel bunker like wounded animals, their shrill warnings echoing off the flickering holoscreens that lined Droth's war room. The purist leader's claws hovered over the final activation sequence, his scarred carapace illuminated by the blood-red glow of the Doomsday console. "Let them see what happens when mongrels bite the hand that feeds," he snarled, inputting the last command. Somewhere deep beneath the surface of Mars, the ancient weapon, a relic of the architect's wrath, hummed to life, its targeting systems locking onto Earth with glacial precision. The countdown flashed, 60 seconds until annihilation. Patel's fingers moved faster than thought, her console a blur of stolen access codes and jury-rigged overrides. She'd tracked the weapon's energy signature the moment it powered up, its archaic systems screaming across the network like a beacon. "Oh, you adorable hypocrite," she muttered, slicing through encryption layers with code fragments scavenged from the Starbreaker's wreckage. The weapon's failsafes were formidable, meant to withstand any outside interference, but Droth had made one fatal mistake. He'd used a Council command spire as his control hub, and Patel knew those systems intimately. With 3 seconds left, the weapon's trajectory stuttered, then pivoted. The targeting lasers, meant to paint Earth's major cities, instead flickered wildly before locking onto the coordinates of Droth's own fortress. The purist's face twisted in dawning horror as his monitors flickered to life, displaying Patel's grinning face. "Funny thing about Doomsday devices," she said, wiping grease from her brow. "They hate last-minute edits." Then the screen dissolved into static as the weapon's payload erupted not toward Earth, but upward, a searing column of plasma carving through rock and metal alike to engulf Droth's stronghold in a firestorm. The sky above Mars burned that night, not with the death of a planet, but with the pyre of a tyrant's ambition. On the Iron Resolve's observation deck, Vance watched the fireworks through a reflection of Patel's exhausted smirk on the viewport. "Remind me never to piss you off," he said, handing her a mug of something strong enough to melt reactor plating. She took it, her gaze still locked on the distant inferno. "Best part," she murmured, "that wasn't even my good hack." And as the debris rained down onto the Martian dunes, the lesson lingered thicker than the smoke. Humanity didn't just outfight you. They outthought you, usually while stealing your best toys. The dust settled over the ruins of the purest stronghold, the air thick with the acrid scent of ionized metal and spent rage. Kael stood at the edge of the crater where Droth's command hub had once been, his boots crunching on shattered debris. Around him, the surviving rebels knelt in shackles, direction shock troopers, Tarkhelan zealots, even a handful of rogue mercenaries, their faces etched with the hollow stare of the defeated. The galaxy held its breath. This was the moment empires demanded blood. Kael unclipped his holster, letting it drop to the ground with a thud that echoed louder than any gunshot. "We could have slaughtered you," he said, his voice carrying across the silent battlefield. Not a snarl, not a boast, a fact. The rebels flinched, bracing for the inevitable. But then Kael did something far more terrifying than raising a weapon. He extended a hand. "But we'd rather you learn." The shock that rippled through the crowd was palpable. A grizzled Tarkhelan warlord, his carapace cracked from battle, spat at Kael's feet. "You want us to grovel, beg for scraps from your table?" Kael didn't blink. "I want you to build." With a flick of his wrist, holograms flared to life above the ruins, displaying blueprints of orbital farms over Tarkella, Diraction mining colonies retrofitted with human-designed safety systems, even a joint research hub on the ashes of Droth's fortress. "The architects lied to us all," Kael continued, stepping closer. "They told you obedience was strength, told you hierarchy was law, but look what happened when someone finally questioned it." A young Diraction soldier, her chitin still streaked with soot, stared at the projections. "You're just replacing one master with another." Kael shook his head. "No masters, no mandates, just choices." He tapped his chest where the Orion Accord's sigil gleamed. "Sign or don't, fight or walk away, but know this: every second you spend clinging to old hatreds is a second the real enemy gets stronger." Silence stretched, thick as nebula dust. Then, one by one, the rebels did the unthinkable. They stood, not in surrender, but in something far more dangerous: curiosity. The warlord grimaced, but his claws didn't reach for his blade. "And if we refuse your mercy," Kael's smile was razor-thin, "then you'll never know what you could have been." As the suns dipped below Mars's horizon, casting long shadows over the shattered battlefield, the galaxy learned a new truth. Humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their warships or their stolen tech. It was their ability to offer a future so blinding, even their enemies couldn't help but reach for it. The chamber that had once echoed with the sneers of the Galactic Council now stood deathly silent, every screen across the cosmos locked onto the trembling figure of High Chancellor Vex as he stepped forward. His golden robes, once a symbol of unshakable authority, hung loose like tarnished banners. The air itself seemed to thicken as he raised his hands, not in command, but in surrender. "We were fools," the words crackled across the comms, each syllable weighted with the gravity of 1,000 shattered assumptions. "We mistook ingenuity for insolence, adaptation for defiance. But the architect's greatest sin wasn't creating you. It was convincing us to fear what we didn't understand." A ripple moved through the assembled crowd: former enemies, wary allies, even the scarred veterans of Droth's rebellion, all frozen by the sight of the galaxy's most powerful being bowing his head. Vex's voice, once a whip of certainty, frayed at the edges. "You weren't just stronger, you were right." The admission hung in the air like a guillotine's pause before the drop. Then Kael strode to the podium, his boots scuffing the same steps where Earth's fate had once been sealed with a gavel strike. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He simply placed a hand on Vex's shoulder, a gesture so alien to council decorum that the Diraction ambassadors hissed in shock, and turned to the galaxy. "Hate's easy," he said, his voice carrying the rough warmth of a hearth in dead space. "So's revenge, but they're both dead-end fuels, burns bright, leaves nothing but ash." Behind him, the holograms flickered to life, showing the wreckage of the Starbreaker, the scorched plains of Kalshir, the rubble of Mars, each a monument to what happened when pride outran wisdom. Kael's next words weren't a demand, they were an offering. "You want to honor today, don't just tear down their old gates. Help us build new ones wide enough for everyone." The screens shifted again, this time to schematics of interspecies shipyards, cross-pollinated research colonies, even a proposed neural network linking Tarkellan dream singers with human coders. "The architects left us a galaxy of cages. Let's give it something better, choices." A murmur built in the chamber, not of dissent, but of dawning reckoning. The young Diraction soldier who'd spat at Kael's feet days earlier now clutched a stolen human medkit to her chest, her chitin still streaked with the green of her people's mourning ritual. The Tarkellan warlord, his claws still stained with the dust of his fallen fortress, reached for a datapad, not to sign, not yet, but to read, and in the shadows, Seeris watched, her third eye pulsing with something almost like hope. Because this wasn't just surrender, it wasn't even victory, it was the first whisper of a galaxy learning to speak a new language, one without masters, without chains, without the suffocating weight of inevitability. And as the first beams of dawn light pierced the chamber's fractured dome, glinting off the rubble of the old order, one truth rang clearer than any council decree: the future wasn't something to be dictated. It was something to be built, together. The war room smelled of ozone and scorched metal, its walls lined with holograms flickering between battle maps and treaty drafts. Species that had spent centuries at each other's throats now stood shoulder to shoulder. Direction warlords hunched over star charts with Tarkalan engineers, Kael's hollow scavengers trading schematics with human tacticians. The air hummed with something sharper than tension, fiercer than hope, the electric buzz of a galaxy rewriting its own rules. Seeris materialized at Kael's elbow, her three eyes reflecting the chaos. "You've united them," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the din of arguments and laughter. By terrifying them, Kael didn't look up from the draft charter glowing on his tablet, its clauses a patchwork of hard-won compromises and stolen council loopholes. His grin was a blade in the dim light. "Works for me." She studied the room, the way the young Diraxian soldier from the battlefield now leaned in as Patel explained how to jury-rig a shield generator, how the Tarkalan warlord begrudgingly conceded a supply route to the methane miners. "They're not just cooperating," Seeris observed, "they're learning." Kael tapped the screen, highlighting a line about shared defense protocols. "Funny thing about fear. First it paralyzes, then it focuses." He nodded toward a holodisplay where Vance was demonstrating how human railguns could be modified for Diraxian power cores. They spent so long being told what they couldn't do, it never occurred to them to try. A chime sounded. The charter was complete, its final terms pulsing in the center of the room. The silence that followed wasn't reverence, it was the quiet before a leap. The Tarkalan warlord was the first to step forward, his claws hesitating over the approval seal. "If we sign this, there's no going back." Kael didn't flinch. Was there ever? One by one, the seals flared to life. Diraxian blood glyphs, Tarkalan energy sigils. Even the rough plasma burns the hollow miners used as signatures. When the last one clicked into place, the room didn't erupt in cheers, it exhaled. Seeris watched the holographic document spin above them, its edges already fraying with proposed amendments and addendums. "They'll call this madness," she said. Kael stretched, rolling the stiffness from his shoulders. "Good, madmen don't wait for permission." He snagged a ration pack from the table, tore it open with his teeth, and tossed half to the Tarkalan. The warlord caught it instinctively, then stared at the offering like it was a live grenade. Somewhere in the silence, a Diraxian chuckled, and just like that, the galaxy's most fragile alliance took its first breath. Not with fanfare, but with the sound of old enemies sharing a meal over a table littered with tomorrow's blueprints. The ruins didn't just whisper, they screamed. Patel's fingers traced the alien glyphs embedded in the Martian monolith, her gloves catching on edges too precise for wind or time to have carved. The symbols weren't random, they were coordinates, a star map older than human civilization, its lines converging on a single, pulsing point in the deep black. Her breath fogged the inside of her visor as the realization hit. "They're still out there," she murmured, the words bouncing through the comms like a live wire. Vance's chuckle was all edges. "Then let's go say hello." His knuckles cracked, the sound sharp over the static. Around them, the derelict chamber hummed with an energy that had nothing to do with machinery. the kind of quiet fury that builds when the hunted realizes it's holding the hunter's leash. The data unfolded like a nightmare-given form. Scans showed the map wasn't just directions, it was a ledger, worlds listed in columns, each marked with dates and biometric sigils, not conquests. Harvests, the creators hadn't just shaped the Council's species, they'd been pruning them for millennia, culling the ones who asked too many questions, preserving the obedient. Earth's entry glowed at the bottom, a single, damning note beside it. Vanguard strain too volatile, containment protocol initiated. Patel's laugh was hollow. Turns out we weren't just locked out, we were quarantined. Vance studied the map, his jaw working. So what changed? The answer flickered to life on a secondary screen. A transmission log buried in the ruins, its timestamp matching the Council's first contact with Earth. A single phrase, repeated in a looping distress cadence. Containment breach, Vanguard active, retrieve or terminate. Silence pooled between them, thick as orbital debris. Then Vance turned, his boots echoing off the ancient floor. Pack up every scrap, we're taking this straight to Kael. Patel didn't move, and then Vance's grin was a blade in the half-light. Then we show the galaxy what happens when the lab rats bite back. Outside, the Martian wind howled through the ruins, scattering dust across millennia-old footprints. The creators had left their mark. Now, humanity would return the favor. The transmission crackled across every comm channel in the fleet, its signal cutting through encryption and static like a knife through paper. No origin point, no identification markers, just 5 words, repeating in a dozen dead languages before resolving into galactic common. You have awakened. Prepare. The bridge of the iron resolve went dead silent, not the quiet of discipline, but the kind of stillness that comes when a predator's shadow passes overhead. Kael didn't flinch. His fingers tightened around the railing, the metal groaning under his grip as he studied the star map flaring to life on the main display. A single pulsing coordinate blinked in the uncharted deep, far beyond Council space, beyond even the fringe colonies, battle stations, he said, his voice so calm it sent shivers down the spines of the crew. Full alert protocol, and somebody get Patel up here now. The reaction was instantaneous. Klaxons wailed through the corridors as Marines scrambled into armor still streaked with Martian dust. Fighter pilots sprinted to their ships, their pre-flight checks twice as fast as regulation. On the engineering deck, Patel tore open a maintenance panel, her hands moving on instinct as she rerouted power from non-essentials to the Resolve's newly installed shield matrix, a hybrid of human ingenuity and scavenged Council tech. Tell me we cracked their long-range sensors, she hissed into her headset. The reply from the science team was less than comforting. We didn't, they did. Vance materialized at Kael's side, his sidearm already drawn and checked. You thinking what I'm thinking? Kael's smile was razor thin. Turns out the Council wasn't the biggest fish. The holographic star map flickered, recalculating trajectories not toward the signal's origin, but to the derelict Martian monolith. Its glyphs, once thought to be warnings, now pulsed in perfect sync with the transmission. Patel's voice cut through the chaos, her usual snark replaced by something darker. Bad news, those symbols we thought were coordinates, they're not a map. They're a timer. Silence crashed over the bridge again, heavier this time. The crew exchanged glances, the unspoken truth hanging between them like a guillotine's blade. Humanity had spent centuries clawing its way out of the dark, had toppled an empire, had even begun stitching the galaxy back together. But this was something older. Something hungrier. Kael turned to the viewport, where the stars burned cold and indifferent. Helm, he said, soft as a trigger pull, set course for the monolith. And somebody tell the Orion delegates the meeting's postponed. Outside, the void watched back, and for the first time since the war began, it felt like the universe was holding its breath. Earth's orbital docks burned with activity, a symphony of clanging metal and roaring engines as the last battleship slotted into formation. Below, the planet's surface bristled with defenses, railgun batteries scavenged from fallen enforcer fleets, shield generators stitched together from stolen schematics, even repurposed mining lasers turned skyward like a forest of thorns. This wasn't just a fleet, it was a statement. Vance's voice cut through the static of 1,000 open channels, his face flickering across view screens from the Martian shipyards to the Tarkelian front. They called us vermin, he growled, the scar along his jaw pulling taut. Said we'd scurry back to our hole once the shooting started. Behind him, the Iron Resolve's bridge hummed with restrained fury, crew members exchanging grins sharp enough to draw blood. Well, here's the thing about rats, we don't just survive, we multiply. The Diraxian shock troops had been the first to join, their chitinous armor still scorched from the purest uprisings. Then came the Kael's hollow miners, their ramshackle freighters now studded with jury-rigged plasma cannons. Even a rogue faction of Tarkelian dreadnoughts, their commanders swayed less by idealism than the cold calculus of survival, slid into formation at the fleet's flanks. The holographic tactical display pulsed with their combined strength, a patchwork armada stitched together from the galaxy's cast-offs, their unity as improbable as it was terrifying. Vance's final words weren't a rallying cry, they were a blade slipped between the ribs of doubt. You doubted us once. The Resolve's engines flared to life, their eerie blue glow reflecting in his pupils. Don't make that mistake again. As the fleet surged forward, tearing into the void toward the monolith's cryptic coordinates, the galaxy held its breath. This wasn't just a battle formation, it was evolution in motion the moment the prey turned and bared its teeth at the hunter, and somewhere in the dark, the architect's signal kept repeating, its tone shifting from warning to something almost like curiosity. The Resolve's warp drive engaged with a thunderclap of distorted reality, the stars stretching into streaks of light. Behind them, Earth's defenses hummed, ready for whatever came hunting. But the unspoken truth echoed through every ship in that ragged armada. Humanity wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. They were answering the oldest question in the cosmos: what happens when the experiment fights back? The viewport shimmered as the last human warship winked out of real space, their warp trails stretching like claw marks across the stars. High Chancellor Vex's reflection trembled in the glass, his golden robes dull against the void where Earth's defiance had just been. The council chamber, once a monument to absolute certainty, now hummed with the static of shattered assumptions. A Diraxian admiral broke the silence, his chitin clacking as he slumped into his throne. They took the Kael's hollow scavengers with them, and the Tarkelian dissenters, even the Vex's fist slammed down, cracking the obsidian table. We see. His snarl dissolved into something quieter, frayed at the edges. The holograms told the story well enough. Every faction that had ever chafed under council rule now sailed in humanity's wake, their ships a ragged constellation of rebellion. Seeris stepped forward, her third eye pulsing as she studied the tactical feed, not the fleet formations or weapon signatures, but the patterns. Human vessels moved differently now. Their stolen tech had been reforged, their tactics refined in the crucible of the purest uprising. Where council ships flew in rigid formations, Kael's armada flowed like ink in water, constantly adapting. She zoomed in on the Iron Resolve's last transmission, frozen on screen, Vance's scarred face grinning as he tossed a derelict enforcer drone into the recycler. Always appreciate the donations, he'd quipped before the feed cut,
A junior Tarkellen aide, her frills still flushed with youth, dared to whisper what the others couldn't. What if they're right about the architects? The chamber's temperature seemed to drop. Vex rounded on her, then froze because the data didn't lie. The Martian monolith's glyphs matched the Council's oldest archives too precisely. Kael's final broadcast played again in the silence, his voice stripped of its usual edge, almost gentle. "You spent centuries building walls to keep us out." The hologram flickered, showing Earth's orbital defenses not pointed outward, but inward, fortifying the system against something beyond the Council's grasp. Turns out we were the ones being protected. The transmission ended with a Diraxian shock trooper tossing a human engineer a plasma wrench, their laughter raw and real. As the screens darkened, the weight of it settled over the chamber like cosmic dust. The Council hadn't just lost a war, they'd been outgrown, not by weapons or warships, but by an idea they'd spent lifetimes trying to extinguish. Unity without subjugation, strength without cruelty, Vex exhaled, his breath fogging the viewport where Earth's fleet had vanished. Outside, the stars burned indifferent and cold. Somewhere in the deep black, humanity's torch flared brighter, and for the first time in 1,000 years, the galaxy held its breath to see what darkness it might illuminate.